In the autumn of 9 AD, somewhere in the dense forests east of the Rhine, a Roman army ceased to exist. Not in the way armies normally lose, retreating, regrouping, limping home to fight again. This army was swallowed. 3 full legions, the XVIII, the 18th, the 19th, along with 6 auxiliary cohorts and 3 cavalry squadrons, marched into the forest under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus,
Germanicus,
the governor of Germania. Roughly 20,000 men. Soldiers, engineers, medics, servants, camp followers. An entire moving civilization, stretching for kilometers through narrow woodland trails. None of them came back. The man who destroyed them was not a foreign king or a rival general from a competing empire. He was a Roman officer. Arminius, son of Segimur, chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, had grown up inside the Roman military system. He held Roman citizenship. He commanded Germanic auxiliary troops under Roman authority. He had studied Roman tactics from the inside, the marching formations, the camp construction protocols, the chain of command, the way Roman discipline could be exploited when stretched thin across unfamiliar terrain. And here lies the strategic truth that separates Teutoburg from every other Roman defeat. This was not a failure of strength. It was a failure of intelligence. Rome's system for identifying threats relied heavily on the loyalty of allied tribal leaders. When one of those leaders was the threat itself, the entire apparatus collapsed. A Roman legion on open ground was nearly invincible, but a Roman legion strung out along a forest path, wagons stuck in mud, cavalry useless between the trees, flanks exposed to elevated ground on both sides, that was a different organism entirely. Arminius understood this with the precision of a surgeon. He chose the terrain. He controlled the timing. He manufactured the crisis, a fabricated tribal rebellion that lured Varus off his planned route and into the killing ground. Over 3 days of continuous ambush, the Roman column disintegrated. Officers were killed in the first hours. Units lost contact with each other. Rain turned the soil into a swamp that dragged down armored men and rendered their heavy shields nearly useless. By the 3rd day, Varus fell on his own sword. His senior officers followed. The remaining soldiers, exhausted, leaderless, surrounded, were massacred or captured. Those captured faced ritual execution in sacred groves, their skulls nailed to oak trees as offerings to Germanic gods. 3 legionary eagles, the aquili, the sacred golden standards that represented not merely military units but the divine authority of Rome itself, were seized as trophies. In Roman belief, losing an eagle was worse than losing a battle. It was a spiritual catastrophe. When messengers reached Emperor Augustus with reports of the disaster, the 71-year-old ruler, the man who had transformed Rome from a crumbling republic into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, could not process what he was hearing. According to the historian Suetonius, writing decades later, Augustus let his beard and hair grow for months in. Mourning, he wandered the corridors of his palace at night, striking the walls with his head, and repeating a single phrase, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." This was more than grief. It was strategic terror. Augustus feared that Arminius would press his advantage, cross the Rhine, and threaten Gaul, the wealthy, vital province that connected Rome to its northern territories. If Gaul fell, the entire Western Empire could fragment. Augustus responded with immediate defensive measures. He reinforced the Rhine with veteran units pulled from other frontiers. He stationed his most experienced general, his stepson Tiberius, to oversee the border personally. He ordered emergency conscription in Rome and Italy, a deeply unpopular measure in a city that had grown accustomed to peace. When citizens resisted the draft, Augustus had some of them executed as an example. The man who had built his reign on stability was now ruling through fear. But the feared Germanic invasion never came. Arminius had achieved something extraordinary, but he lacked the political infrastructure to exploit it. The Germanic tribes were not a unified state. They were dozens of independent groups, often hostile to each other, held together only by temporary alliances and personal charisma. Arminius could win a battle, but he could not build an empire. And without an empire, he could not threaten one. This distinction matters because it reveals a psychological dimension that shaped everything that followed. Rome's response to Teutoburg was driven not by strategic necessity. The actual threat to Roman territory was limited, but by humiliation. The loss of the eagles, the desecration of Roman dead, the fact that a man who had eaten at Roman tables and worn Roman armor had orchestrated the destruction, all of this demanded a response that went beyond military logic. Rome needed vengeance. Not because it would make the empire safer, but because without it, the empire's psychological foundation, the belief in Roman invincibility, would crack. The destroyed legions, Xth, 18th, and 19th, were never reconstituted. Their numbers were permanently retired from the Roman military rolls. No future legion would ever carry those designations. It was an institutional scar, deliberately left open, a reminder coded into the bureaucratic structure of the most organized military force in the ancient world. For 5 years, Rome held the Rhine and waited. Augustus aged rapidly. His health deteriorated. The trauma of Teutoburg seemed to accelerate his decline. On August 19, 14 AD, Augustus died at Nola, in the same room where his father had died decades earlier. His final words, according to Suetonius, were directed at his wife. "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." Even in death, Augustus understood that power was performance. Tiberius, his stepson, became emperor, and Tiberius, unlike Augustus, knew Germania personally. He had commanded legions there. He had marched through the forests, crossed the rivers, endured the rains that never seemed to stop. He understood the terrain with a soldier's intimacy. He knew that conquering Germania permanently was likely impossible. The land was too vast, too poor, too fragmented to justify the cost of occupation. But he also knew that the stain of Teutoburg had to be answered. He needed a weapon. Not a blunt one, but a precise one. A commander who could project Roman power deep into Germanic territory, recover the lost eagles, punish the tribes responsible, and then withdraw, leaving devastation behind but not committing Rome to endless occupation. That weapon was Germanicus Julius Caesar. Germanicus was 30 years old when he took command of 8 legions along the Rhine, the largest concentration of military force anywhere in the Roman Empire. He was Augustus's adopted grandson, Tiberius's nephew, and the most popular man in Rome. The legions loved him because he lived among them, ate their food, slept in their camps, and remembered their names. The Roman public loved him because he was young, handsome, eloquent, and victorious. He embodied everything Rome wanted to believe about itself. But Germanicus was also a meticulous strategist, and his first decision revealed how deeply he had studied Varus's failure. Varus had marched a single massive column overland through territory controlled by hostile forces, relying on a single route with no fallback positions. Germanicus refused to repeat that architecture. Instead, he designed a campaign built on convergence, multiple independent forces approaching Germanic territory from different directions simultaneously, making it impossible for Arminius to concentrate his warriors against any single column. In the spring of 15 AD, the campaign began. Aulus Caecinus Severus led 4 legions overland, pushing east through the forest in tight, disciplined formations, never stretching thin, fortifying a full marching camp every single night, deploying scouts in a continuous screen around the column. Every lesson from Teutoburg had been absorbed into standard operating procedure. Germanicus, meanwhile, took 4 more legions aboard nearly 1,000 transport vessels, sailed along the North Sea coast, and entered the EMS River, striking deep behind Germanic lines from a direction no tribal leader had anticipated. The naval approach bypassed the forests entirely, eliminating the terrain advantage that had destroyed Varus. It was bold, it was logistically complex, and it worked. Germanic tribes along the EMS were caught completely unprepared. Roman forces landed, established beachheads, and advanced inland before organized resistance could form. Settlements were burned. Food stores were destroyed or confiscated. The message was unmistakable. Rome had returned, and this time it was not stumbling through the trees. What happened next was not planned. It was discovered. As Germanicus's forces pushed deeper into Germanic territory, they entered a clearing that the scouts recognized from survivor accounts. The ground was uneven, littered with objects that didn't belong in a forest. White fragments, visible through the undergrowth. Metal, glinting beneath layers of decomposed leaves. They had found the Teutoburg battlefield. 6 years of rain and wind had scattered the remains, but the evidence was unmistakable. The historian Tacitus, writing from accounts passed down by participants, described what the soldiers saw. Heaps of whitened bones where men had made final stands. Individual skeletons stretched out where soldiers had tried to flee. Horse remains mixed with human remains. Fragments of weapons, pieces of javelins embedded in tree trunks. And on the surrounding oaks, skulls. Dozens of skulls, nailed to the bark, still facing the clearing where their owners had died. Germanicus ordered the column to halt. For a long time, nobody spoke. This is what psychologists now call confrontation with collective trauma. the moment when a group encounters physical evidence of a catastrophe that has shaped their identity. Every soldier in that clearing had grown up hearing about Teutoburg. Many had lost fathers, brothers, uncles in the disaster. They had been trained specifically to avenge it. Now they were standing in it. Germanicus made a decision that was militarily unnecessary but psychologically essential. He ordered the army to gather every bone they could find. Roman and Germanic remains were too intermingled to separate, and bury them together in a single mass grave. He laid the first piece of earth on the mound himself. Thousands of soldiers followed, each placing a handful of dirt. That night, by torchlight, Germanicus delivered a funeral oration. No transcript survives, but the act itself communicated something that no tactical victory could. Rome had not abandoned its dead. The empire remembered, and now it would act. The campaign that followed was characterized by a methodical, almost industrial ferocity. Germanicus pursued Arminius's forces across multiple engagements, each one designed to force the Germanic coalition into the kind of open field battle where Roman discipline would be decisive. The confrontation came at the Visurgis River, the modern Weser, where Arminius had positioned his forces on the far bank. A deserter revealed the full Germanic battle plan: infantry concealed in a sacred grove, cavalry hidden in nearby woods, prepared to encircle the Roman force once across the water. At dawn, Germanicus ordered the crossing. Roman engineers had already identified the shallowest fording points. Auxiliary cavalry went first, screening the far bank. Then the legions followed, water up to their waists, shields held above their heads, moving in disciplined silence. On the far bank, they formed battle lines with practiced precision. Shields locked, short swords drawn. The Roman formation presented a wall of iron and wood. No gaps, no exposed flanks, every man covering the man beside him. The Germanic charge came with overwhelming noise, war cries, shield beating, the deliberate psychological assault that had terrified Roman columns before. Thousands of warriors sprinted from the tree line, weapons raised, momentum carrying them forward like a wave. The Roman line absorbed the impact. It bent. It did not break. Centurions, the non-commissioned backbone of the Roman army, held their sections together through voice commands and physical presence. When a soldier fell, the man behind stepped forward. When a gap appeared, it closed within seconds. This was not courage alone. This was institutional discipline, the product of months of drilling, decades of military tradition, centuries of tactical refinement. Germanicus, visible in gilded armor, commanded from a position close enough to the front line that he could read the flow of battle personally. When Arminius attempted to draw the Roman infantry toward the forest where ambushes waited, Germanicus recognized the maneuver instantly, the same tactic that had destroyed Varus, and refused to pursue. Instead, he released his cavalry against the Germanic flanks. The result was devastating. Germanic units pressed from the front by infantry and struck from the sides by cavalry began to collapse. Arminius, leading from the front as always, took a javelin wound and had to be carried from the field by his personal guard. Without his presence, the remaining tribal coordination disintegrated. By midday, the field belonged to Rome. Germanic dead lay across the plain in numbers that Tacitus described as covering miles. But Rome's triumph carried a cost that no general could have predicted. As Germanicus's fleet sailed home along the North Sea coast after the campaign season, a sudden and catastrophic storm struck. Winds shredded sails, waves swamped transport ships built for rivers, not open ocean. Legionaries, men who had survived every battle, every ambush, every forced march, drowned in water so cold it killed within minutes. Survivors washed ashore for the following days, some on the German coast, some on distant islands, some clinging to fragments of hull. The material losses exceeded anything Arminius had inflicted. Germanicus had defeated the enemy and been defeated by the sea. When Germanicus returned to the Rhine with his surviving forces, a message from Tiberius was waiting. The emperor congratulated him on his victories. He praised the recovery of 2 of the 3 lost eagles. He acknowledged the restoration of Roman honor. He ordered Germanicus home. The reasoning Tiberius offered was strategic. Germania was too large, too poor, and too politically fragmented to justify permanent occupation. Let the tribes consume themselves in their own internal conflicts. Rome had made its point. There was nothing left to gain. Many modern historians agree with this assessment. The cost of garrisoning Germania would have strained Roman resources with little economic return. Tiberius, whatever his personal motivations, made a defensible strategic calculation. But the timing told a different story. Germanicus had become dangerously popular. The legions were personally loyal to him. The Roman public treated him as a living legend. For an emperor who had spent his entire career in another man's shadow, first Augustus, now potentially Germanicus, that popularity was a threat more dangerous than any Germanic warband. Germanicus returned to a spectacular triumph, a formal procession through Rome's streets that was among the most celebrated in the city's history. Captured weapons were displayed on carts. Germanic prisoners walked in chains. The recovered eagles were carried in positions of honor. Citizens lined every street, crowded every rooftop, threw flowers and shouted his name. 2 years later, on October 10, 19 AD, Germanicus died in Antioch, Syria, at the age of 33. He had been suffering from a sudden, unexplained illness. On his deathbed, he told his wife Agrippina and his friends that he believed he had been poisoned, and that the man responsible was Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, acting on Tiberius's orders. The accusation was never proven. Piso was brought to trial before the Senate, but he died, possibly by suicide, before a verdict was reached. The truth disappeared with both men. What remained was suspicion, and suspicion, in Roman politics, functioned as its own kind of truth. Arminius survived Rome's vengeance, but the coalition he had built fractured almost immediately. Tribes that had united against a common enemy returned to competing with each other. Arminius's attempts to consolidate personal authority, to transform himself from war leader into permanent ruler, alienated allies who saw kingship as a threat to Germanic traditions of collective tribal governance. In 21 AD, Arminius was killed by members of his own family. He was 37 years old. Germanicus had been 33. Two men who had shaped the boundary between Roman civilization and Germanic independence, both dead before 40, both destroyed not by each other, but by the political systems they served. The Rhine remained Rome's permanent northern frontier for the next 4 centuries. Roman watchtowers lined the western bank, their garrisons staring across the water into forests that had consumed an army and resisted an empire. The third eagle, the one Germanicus never recovered, was finally retrieved in 41 AD, 32 years after Teutoburg, under the Emperor Claudius. By then, the men who had carried it into battle were long dead. The men who had captured it were long dead. The object itself had outlived every human being connected to its story. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson embedded in this history. Rome recovered its symbols. It won its battles. It restored its pride. But it never conquered Germania. The forests remained beyond its reach, not because Rome lacked the military power, but because some territories cost more to hold than they are worth, and some victories, no matter how complete, cannot undo the original wound. Tacitus, the Roman historian who documented these campaigns with unflinching detail, later wrote a single sentence that has outlived every monument, every triumph, every emperor who claimed glory from this conflict. He was describing a different frontier, a different war. But the words reach backward across time and settle over Germania like fog over the Rhine, a judgment not on one campaign, but on the nature of empire itself. The bones at Teutoburg were buried. The eagles were recovered. Germanicus received his triumph, and the forest kept its silence.